Rank the albums. Okay, the music of Japan. Not to be confused with ex-Japan, which is where all of their members are now. This is a very speedy career. Across 4 calendar years, there are 5 albums, and the development in the sound between them is just preposterous. I think for some people, with the way that Japan's sound matured, ranking these albums would be very easy because it would just go up in chronological order. Not me, actually, and let's find out why. Their first album, just be careful Googling this one, shows the band in a very young mode, and I think they were quite quickly embarrassed by this. I wouldn't be, I think it still stands up. Though David Sylvian's voice at this point was very bratty, and he'd not really figured out yet what he had to say. I still think this stands as a monolithic example of 70s rock. You could call it a typical example, but it's also pretty damn inventive. Already 2 of the band's ongoing strengths are evident, which are Mick Karn's fretless bass lines and Richard Barbieri's experimental, often atonal use of synthesizers. The rest of the band at this point are far more traditional rock, but I like that, how it's pulling in 2 different directions. And none of those directions are backwards. Rob Dean's guitar is very underrated. He's funky. There's a sassy, sleazy glam vibe to this. They look like the New York Dolls, and maybe that explains some of my affection for this album. It's sticking up for long-haired pretty boys. But for a 1978 debut, it's quite long. The tracks can be quite long, and I think they do earn their length. I think this is a lovely adolescent indulgence. Like, imagine if the New York Dolls were groovy and pleasant to listen to. I think people will object and retch to me rating this highly, at least when I rate some of the latter albums. But I'm not doing this to provoke you, I'm just being sincere. This is a great debut album. It's massively evident why they got a record contract from the quality of their songs and their delivery. Devour any video content you can get from this time. Very soon after this was the immediate follow-up album. It's called Obscure Alternatives, and that reasonably describes what it has to offer. But I think as a follow-up and as a kind of transitional sound, this doesn't have as much to offer by itself. They experiment more with styles, there's more deviation, and the lyrics are settling upon themes of misery, of course, you gotta love misery, and just different places in the world that he'd heard of. I have had phases when I'm more fond of this one. When I put this at the bottom of the stack, it's still a stack of Japan's albums, and I love the albums of Japan. Quiet Life, only 1 calendar year after their debut, is a pretty thorough reinvention. David's found a new means of singing. Maybe it's after working with Giorgio Moroder for one song, I think they learned a lot from him. We're growing away from guitars and towards synthesizers. And it's this lovely, more subtle, more sophisticated music. Yeah, it owes a lot to Bowie and Roxy music, but I think in its own way, new romantic and new wave stuff owes a lot to this. This is a great album, and people will wince at me putting it underneath the debut, but there it goes. I think maybe if it had as much material on it as the debut, I might have put it above. So the people who reissued these on CD were making this Japan circle on the side of it, and that made me buy Assemblage. Don't be fooled by this album, it's quite unclear, but it was a reissued album, but it is a compilation. There is some unique stuff on here, and it is a great listen by itself, but I'm not counting this. Their 4th album takes what they learned on the prior one and just is a bit more of a suite than a set of songs. And I tend to like those. They are arty and mature, and still the band members were incredibly young. By this point, the guitar of Rob Dean has sadly kind of disappeared from the mix. I think that's lamentable across the career arc, but also inevitable, and it doesn't actually detract from this piece. By this point, they're a new kind of band. It's like Berlin era Bowie, but they're a band, so the bass lines are amazing, the synth parts are amazing. This is the sound of some artistically intricate brains at the top of their game, and at the top of the pile of their albums. Then Tin Drum in 1981. further develops in the direction we're already headed from the previous ones. By this point, the band Japan was absolutely obsessed with the Far Eastern Empire of China. I think the instrumental sparseness of this goes a bit too far from me, and, I'd like the guitar to be brought back a bit. They've developed away from my tastes a bit here, but it is still excellent work. The artiness of it is getting a bit too close to fartiness for my tastes, but it still has some of their best tracks on it. It's still a great listen with that taken into consideration. Second from bottom of the 5. There's quite a bit more to discuss from the musicians of Japan, including Sylvian's solo career, different bands they were in, and different permutations of the members of Japan. So I'm gonna hand those across to my voiceover self. Okay, this live album from the end of their career is quite venerated. I don't know, it just sounds like the studio songs at a greater distance, not my thing. The members of Japan regrouped in Everything But Name for Raintree Crow, released 1991. This album meets all the criteria for me to include it in this ranking, but I just don't like it, so I'd rather respect their intended distinction than slag it off. If you hear how much more abstract Japan's music became in 4 years, and add another 8 years to that, that's what you've got. Sparse, rhythmic instrumentals, it's way avant-garde. I'm not cultured enough for this, or much of David Sylvian's solo. It's like he's grown out of entertaining me. Jansen Barbieri projects tend to bring more fun though, and anything with Mick Karn on bass is gonna have that going for it. There are too many compilation albums and reissues, and their old label kept releasing old tracks of singles when they made it big. I'm not Wikipedia, so I'll keep it simple. Japan had 5 albums ranked like this. Then the rising fun